Hi there. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another Innovation Journeys Live. My name is Jessica. I'm really glad to have you here joining us today. We have a really special innovation journey today to share with you. Over the past few weeks, we've shared a lot of these journeys with you, our viewers watching at home. And we've looked at a lot of our historic artifacts, the Allegheny steam engine, the studio glass movement, and we've talked about comic book creators. So we had a really great couple of journeys to share with you along the way. Last week, we talked to project curator Samantha Johnson, and she shared her story of H.J. Hine's with us, as in Hine's ketchup. It was a great learning from failure story, and Samantha helped share with us how mistakes can help you learn and help you improve and make you a little bit better each time. So if you missed it, you should head over to our Facebook page and check it out on the Henry Ford's Facebook page. Before we get started with our interview today, I want to take a quick minute to remind you what Model I is. Model I is our learning framework at the Henry Ford Museum. We studied our artifacts and our innovators, and we noticed that they all kind of use the same actions and the same habits, like uncovering a problem and defining that problem, then designing a solution, optimizing and implementing it. Along the way, they used a lot of similar habits, like staying curious and collaborating, challenging the rules, and learning from failure. And these all work together, the actions and the habits work together to help us study our stories in the past, but also think about our own personal innovation journeys and looking at the world around us today. All of our journeys are going to focus on the habits of innovation moving forward. And today's journey talks about challenging the rules. So this journey takes a little bit of explaining to frame challenging the rules. A lot of times when we think of challenging the rules, we think of things like our parents' rules or our school rules or maybe even society's rules. And certainly sometimes we do need to challenge those rules. If those rules are wrong or unjust or oppressive, we might want to challenge those rules. But we also like to think about challenging the rules when we think about looking at things in a new way. So maybe we could take an object or take a story and think a little bit more deeply about it to gain some new ideas and some new perspectives. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at some amazing women who challenge the rules through weaving and technology. Now you might be wondering how weaving and technology relate to each other. But for that, I'm going to need to bring in the Henry Ford's Curator of Communications and Information Technology, Kristen Gallerneaux. So hi, Kristen.
Hey, everybody.
Thanks for being with us today. We're really excited to talk to you and to take a look at this really cool and exciting topic.
Yeah, I'm really excited to share it with everybody.
Great. So let's jump right in then. So you first had this idea to connect weaving patterns to technology while you were walking through the storage areas at the Henry Ford Museum. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, like maybe a lot of people who are watching today, you've been walking through a museum before in the past and you've been inspired by something. And I find as a curator, I get a lot of inspiration from visiting the Henry Ford. I get a lot of inspiration from visiting other museums. And one place where I find a lot of inspiration is visiting our storage areas. I often take visitors, guests back there to show them some things that maybe they're researching for a special project. And it's a place where I often find that I think about things in different ways. Sometimes it's seeing one thing next to another thing in a way that wasn't intended, that might spark a new way of thinking about a thing. So I think that there's ways that we can study the past in different and new and interesting ways, putting new lenses on top of things while also staying true to the original intent behind those objects. So one example I do a lot of work in lately is sort of expanding our knowledge of women's history and political history, the creative ways that people have engaged in these really sometimes very subtle acts of resistance And this has really grown a lot more for me the closer I've looked into our collections at the Henry Ford. And sometimes it's just scraping back a tiny little layer from the surface of this thing, not literally, but intellectually and mentally to
Yeah.
sort of uncover these hidden stories.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, and so this is one thing that I found a lot of inspiration from, actually. This is a print of an original drawing, and it is something called a shaker gift drawing, and it was made by a woman named Hannah Cohoon in 1854. That's a really long time ago. I first saw this image in college art class, but when I was touring the archives one day with a group of women who are interested in computers, it sort of shook something loose for me. It was something about that combination of people, and in that moment where I started to think about this differently. I started to think of it as not just, some quaint drawing from the 1850s, but it was part of a very charged sort of network almost of objects and, a story of people challenging the rules.
That's great. And so you see these shaker gift drawings as a way of challenging gender expectations, or like a way for women to get around what their standards and systems demanded of them.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important to know about the visual history of the Shakers is that a lot of their work was focused on function. There was very little decoration in their homes. They were very sparse, as you can see in this image. But their furniture was focused on the sort of very beautiful and refined craft skills. And it was very much about celebrating simplicity. But in the era of manifestations, this time period when these Shaker gift drawings were being made, there were women in the Shaker community who were claiming that they were receiving these gifts in the form of visions and dreams from their relatives who'd passed away. And these drawings were made to document those messages. So today I'd like to think of these prints as a way that the women were gently pushing back against the systems of rules that have been defined by their belief system. They figured out a way to share these artistic visions. And there are some interesting parallels visually in how these drawings look a lot like computer circuits. There's a sort of density, there's a sort of density of information that makes these drawings seem very, very modern, not from the 1850s. This is a computer circuit off to the right-hand side of the screen. So these drawings are very packed with ideas, and they sort of branch off in all these different directions, very similar almost to how we interact with the internet today.
Wow, that's really fascinating. You can see clearly the connections there in the drawings and the circuit. That's really interesting. We also have at the Henry Ford a very significant artifact. In fact, we have a very rare working Jacquard loom at Greenfield Village. Can you tell us what makes Jacquard's loom so special?
Yeah, so this is an image of an industrial loom. This is not the one we have in Greenfield Village, but I'll show you that image in a moment. So this is a very exceptional artifact connected to a period in history that ran from like the 18th century into the 19th century. It was called the Industrial Revolution. And much like it sounds, that was a time that was defined by an increase in machines performing and helping humans to perform labor much more quickly. And it's a very complex moment in history, but that's the sort of crux of it right there. And there were benefits to machines helping us increase our labor, obviously increase productivity, but there were also very troubling issues connected with this time, things like child labor and pollution of our environment and the loss of handcraft jobs. So this is a Jacquard Coverlet. This is something that would have been woven on a Jacquard loom. And the loom was very important to allow people to weave these very complex patterns. Normally, these would have been woven by hand before the Jacquard loom, and it would have taken a really, really long time. But with this Jacquard loom, you could move to something almost like the Model T into mass production. So you could suddenly have way more fabric, which made it way cheaper to produce. And it did so using the loom, did this by an attachment that would sit on top of the loom in a program of punched cards, which have an interesting connection to computing that we'll get into in a few minutes. This is our loom that we operate in Greenfield Village, even today. This image was taken much longer ago than today, obviously. But this is a Jacquard loom that's powered by people, and you can see these lines of punch cards running along the side. And this is a little bit more of a charming approach than that giant industrial loom. So this is an image. you know, that it really captures the stories of the people that were helping to keep these looms running smoothly. You might recognize that these are children, and children definitely are not allowed, nor should they have ever been allowed to work in factories. But back in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, they were workers in factories, and it was quite dangerous. And we've lost a lot of narratives connected to these women's and young people's history. What we do know is that a lot of women working in the textile mills at that time, there was a really strong educational culture. People were really eager to learn. And there were these company newsletters that were published by the women working in the factories with poems and readings. There were very active libraries, and there were lectures that people would attend. And I love this story so much. A lot of the women who worked in the textile factories working these looms would pin up math problems on the machines that they were working to keep their minds nimble. And especially, you know, this was important because a lot of factories actually banned talking during work hours. So eventually these women began to mobilize, and they actually kind of rallied against, you know, the view that their work was simply women's work, you know, which is very detrimental to the amount of contributions that they made. And they formed unions, and they even went on strike to try to argue for better treatment.
Wow, that's incredible. It's so interesting. That is a great story. How does the Jacquard loom connect with technology and computers?
Well, you can see this image here, which is a line of Jacquard. It's a Jacquard loom program, basically. If you think of this as a computer program, you can see all those little holes that are punched out. And in the bottom corner, that's a computer punch card. And this basically works the exact same way that a Jacquard loom did. You have holes in the card that either allow parts of the loom to pass through and weave part of a program or not. And you have a Jacquard, you have a computer punch card, which allows, you know, these holes to either be read as ones or zeros. And if you know anything about early computer programming, it works on a binary system. That means there are ones and zeros. So if you think of these holes as being ones and zeros, there's a very clear connection between these two things. And I want to share this image. This is a really important image that bridges the history of Jacquard weaving and the history of computers. This isn't a photograph or a print. This is actually a weaving, and I hope you can kind of see in the detail on the right-hand side that this is actually a woven image, and it was made on a Jacquard loom. This is a portrait of Jacquard, the person who invented the loom, and it took about 24,000 punch cards on a loom to make this thing. And again, this is kind of very much like the first kind of digital art. Where it gets really interesting is that a gentleman named Charles Babbage, who is very important in the history of computing, he owned one of these silk portraits. And it made him realize just how important punch cards were to computing history as well as to the Jacquard loom. And it inspired him to make this device called the Analytical engine. It's a very early computer that mostly existed on paper. It was never fully built. But if he had managed to build it, Babbage had planned to use punch cards to run computer programs on it. And this, of course, is one of my own personal heroes. This is Ada Lovelace, and she was friends with Charles Babbage. She actually did a lot of work outside of what was expected of a woman at that time. She was very intellectual. She translated and improved this early computer science paper written about Babbage's work. And in the process, she actually wrote what is regarded as the very first machine algorithm. That's also known as a computer program. So we can say Ada Lovelace is one of the very first computer programmers, which I think is absolutely awesome. We could do a whole talk on Ada Lovelace, but you know, I know we need to move on with things. But she has you know, very strong references about she was sort of regarding the Jacquard loom directly and talking about how you could weave algebra and flowers through language as well as on the Jacquard loom. So she had this very interesting creative but also scientific mindset.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I would love to know more about her because she just sounds super interesting. There is another group of women, though, that you are going to talk about. They become known as the LOLs. How do they challenge what we think we know?
Yeah, so before we get to the LOLs, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment, we need to step back again to those women who were working in textile mills. So in history books, you often see this idea that women in textile mills were hired for something called their nimble fingers. And this meant that they had very small and very slender hands that could kind of dart in and out of these very dangerous industrial textile machines. They were very quick with their hands and very patient. And of course, there are a lot of problems with this language and thinking this way, right? This is sort of like a problematic area of history. But the punch cards that were used to program the Jacquard looms eventually become absorbed into other types of technology. They become absorbed into machinery used to help process the 1890 census, called tabulating machines, you see in the middle here. And then they eventually moved over into these really huge computer installations in the 1960s. And women were mainly the people who were hired as operators, verifiers, and programmers for this early technology. So as technology improved, punch cards were used to replace something. There was a new kind of memory called core memory. And what you're seeing on your screen here is a square. It's woven from copper wire. And where each thread crosses over each other, there's these tiny little donuts, we'll call them. They're made of a material called ferrite, which you can see here. And those wires would pass through each of these tiny little cores 3 or 4 times sometimes. And since these cores were made out of magnetic material, you could send electricity through them. And that could help to change the state to either positive or negative. And that state, again, breaks down into that very simple idea of binary computer program, ones and zeros. So this type of memory, these little cores can help to store memory or store information, sometimes permanently, which finally brings us, and this is just another image of core memory, to the LOLs. And I'm not talking about laugh out loud. That's often how it's described on the internet today, right? This is called, the LOLs breaks down into the little old ladies, and they worked in the electronics industry. And this is a very unkind name. It was a name that was applied to these women by typically their male managers, and we would never call women this. And these women are probably middle-aged at best, so it's not very nice, but this is the name that is stuck. And I personally had never really thought much about how core memory was made. I'd always assumed that it had been made by machines. But I was absolutely wrong. And each one of these core memory planes I discovered took over 40 hours to weave by actual people, by these women, called the LOLs. And it's a really fascinating story because remember that line I said about women having nimble fingers in the textile industry? Those same descriptions end up getting applied to the women who were weaving core memory. And so, there are a lot of cases. There were 2 women, as you can see in this image, working at a workstation, passing a needle back and forth, sewing software for these giant computers, 1 bit at a time. And the reason I have an image of a space flight here is because core memory, a type of core memory, was actually used in the Apollo mission that helped us get to the moon. And a lot of the women who wove that core memory, they had been laid off from work from textile mills. So there's this very interesting sort of combined history going on here. And this is a piece of core memory that's actually in the Henry Ford's collection. And it would have been used in a computer called the Burroughs B5000. And this same computer was used by NASA to coordinate the launch of Project Gemini. So you have women's weaving in outer space. Who knew?
Wow, I'm so impressed. I can't imagine sewing those by hand. It's really, really amazing. When we're thinking about computers and this connection to weaving here, a lot of kids watching at home might not know that computers used to be huge, like the size of a whole room. But today we have tiny computers, right inside of our cell phones that have more power than these computers in the whole room would be full of. So how did we get from these giant computers to like home computer use?
Yeah. So, the very simple answer is that as technology improved, computers become smaller. I think that's the way we have a lot of technology, in our lives. And I love this image of the women who helped to program the ENIAC computer. This is one of the first computers. And you can see in their hands here, they're holding vacuum tubes. And that is actually what powered the computers back then, which is why they had to be so huge, literally the size of rooms, like you said, Jessica. And, you know, the vacuum tube eventually starts to shrink down in size. So to put it into context, one bit, that's like one tiny little bit of information, would be in a vacuum tube, would take about the amount of room of the size of your thumb. And then we get to things called transistors and integrated circuits. Today we have silicon computer chips, and this might even be outdated by this time, but the amount of information that we can fit on a silicon chip, you can fit millions of bits onto a chip the size of your fingernail. So that is essentially why computers shrunk down. And one computer, I just want to talk really briefly about this is one of my favorite computers we acquired at the museum recently. It's called the LINC computer, the Laboratory Instrument Computer. And it is designed for science and medical labs. So this isn't the type of computer you would have in your home. But it was also very important because scientific researchers at that time, they had to share these giant room-sized computers. And this was a timeshare system, it was called. And it made work very slow. You had to submit these decks of punch cards to a room, and they would sort of put your requests in a queue, and sometimes it would take a whole day or even longer to get your answers back. So it was a very sluggish way of working. But the LINC was a computer that was designed to be installed in one single researcher's laboratory, and they didn't have to share it. It was just theirs, and they could process their data in real time. They did not have to rely on punch cards. And what I love about this story is this is Mary Ellen Wilkes, and she helped to design the operating system for the LINC. And her backstory is really fantastic too, because she was actually a philosophy graduate. She didn't know anything about computer science, but she showed up at this place called the Lincoln Laboratory, and she just was like, hey, I want to learn about computers. And they trusted her, and they helped her to learn on the fly. And she had sort of gained this knowledge in philosophy, of like abstract philosophy, that was very transferable to computer science. So I just love this image of her. And what's also really cool, the story gets even better. Technically, and some people might fight against this, I would say that Mary Ellen Wilkes is one of the first people to actually have a personal computer in her home, because she was out traveling, and the Lincoln Lab decided to move from MIT to Washington in St. Louis, and she didn't want to move to St. Louis. So she actually took a LINC home to her living room in Baltimore, and she finished programming the operating system from there. And her dad actually took these photos of her. He was very proud of her. So that's a small little blip in computer history for you.
Yeah, what a cool challenge the rules story. I think that's great. Changing gears a little bit. So everyone at home watching this everyone in the world is familiar with Macintosh and Apple, right? A few people have heard of Susan Kare. Yet she's a great person to talk about when we're thinking of challenging the boundaries of the tools you are given. So can you tell me about Susan Kare?
Yeah. So this is another major icon in my life as a woman who is involved in the history of technology. This is Susan Kare, and she also trained as an art historian, and she briefly became a museum curator. But she wasn't exactly satisfied in that field, and she had this friend who was named Andy Hertzfeld, and he was one of the original founders of Apple Computers, and he called Susan up to offer her a job doing interface design at Apple. And you may be familiar with some of these icons. These are the icons that Susan Kare designed for the original Macintosh computer. It's this sort of visual graphics system that's echoed down through the years onto some of our desktops today. Like, I can see the lasso in here, and I know that I use that in Photoshop. There is the floppy disk. We don't have floppy disks anymore, but we know the save icon. There's the arrow pointer, there's the sound volume thing, and all of these things have sort of echoed down into our desktops today. And I just love these because she worked on such a limited amount of visual space and capability, and made these this is going to sound cheesy, but iconic icons, right? And this is how she designed them, because she wanted to get her ideas down, and there really wasn't anything like Photoshop or even, Microsoft Paint or anything like that yet. So she took pieces of graph paper and she started filling in the blanks, because these pieces of these sort of layout of graph paper basically mimicked how detailed something could be on a computer screen at that time. Some of you may know that computer graphics have progressed to the point where we very much take advantage of how good everything looks. But even when I was a kid, things looked blocky. Things looked like they were made on an 8-bit space. So yeah, this is one of my favorites of Susan Kjaer's icons.
Yeah, awesome. And interestingly, we can connect these images back to the Jacquard Loom, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So on the right-hand side, we have a pair of scissors. That's Susan Kjaer, designed for an icon. And the images you see on the other side show, the one on top shows a woman translating a design into the punched cards used for a Jacquard loom. And she's using a drawing called a mise en carte. And if you look at that bottom image, you look really closely, you can see that it is divided up into basically like a graph paper-like grid, which basically mimics, again, how the pixels on a computer screen, especially in the 1980s, worked. You had a very limited amount of space to convey information. So again, either a pixel on the grid is filled in or it isn't. So think back to that binary idea of ones and zeros. The black filled in square might be a 1, whereas the white space on a page is a 0. And these mise en carte drawings sort of helped loom operators decide how to punch the cards to program the loom. And by the way, today, Susan Kjaer actually helps to lead the creative team at Pinterest, which is maybe a more contemporary platform that kids listening today might recognize.
Wow, so many connections all around through all of this. A lot of kids watching at home right now might be thinking about history and thinking it's pretty straightforward, right? We have our textbooks in school, they're all facts, they're all dates. But I think maybe what this discussion today has sort of brought to light for us is that we can take one story, we can take one artifact, and we can look at it in a lot of different ways. That challenging what you think you know can be a really powerful way to gain new ideas and understanding.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. We should always look closely at history. We should think about how there could be new lenses that we can consider a story, and ask ourselves, is everybody's voice being represented here? Who are we forgetting? When was this history written? What's missing? Are there things that have been misrepresented that we might reconsider? And this has happened time and time again in what we would call the accepted historical canon. So there's all types of history, right? From art history to social and cultural history and histories of race and politics. They're all very complicated things to understand and unravel. And they are these constantly moving subjects that we can always map something new onto. And as curators, we have the opportunity to challenge how artifacts are interpreted. We can prevent the loss of people's stories or connected to objects and recover them. And in this case today, we've touched on just one really small story that recovers women's contributions to industry and technology, creativity, and these things are lingering, just slightly hidden right below the surface.
Yeah, I would challenge everybody who's watching to think about it in this way, and to think about how they could look at different stories in their own lives and take some new perspectives from it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we go, I did want to ask you just one question from one of our viewers that are watching. If you have like a favorite artifact that connects with weaving or technology, and this topic, is there just one story that really comes to life for you?
Yeah, well, there's that silk portrait that I showed of Jacquard, and it's really fascinating because it's like this perfect bridge item that's it's just as important to the history of weaving as it is to the history of computer technology. And it's just like condensed down into this one space. And I often, when I, take people on tours of our archives, I often pull this drawing and then I'll put it next to one of Susan Care's icons and just sort of see if anybody really gets the comparison. And often people do, but then those who don't immediately see it, once you explain to them, they're like, oh, wow, this has the potential to sort of like reframe really immediately just by comparing these two artifacts side by side, how people think about things, and I think there are just so many artifacts in museums that have these sort of very active voices that as a curator, I get so geeked about it.
That's awesome. That's really powerful, I think, to see those right next to each other. Definitely. I bet that's a really powerful thing. I know I was fascinated when I saw that weaving, and you said it was not a print. I couldn't believe that. So that's really powerful to see that. Amazing. Well, thanks, Kristen, for being with us today. It's been really great to hear this story and have you with us to share this story. It's wonderful having you here. So thank you.
Thanks. Always glad to help. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you are watching at home and you'd like to learn a little bit more about these connections between weaving and technology, head over to our website. And if you click on the Explore tab and you scroll through our Connect 3 films, you are going to find a really great one called Interwoven Influence on personal computing, where you can dive a little bit more deeply into some of the things that we talked about with Kristen today. So highly recommend heading over there. Also, you can join Mo Rocca for an Innovation Nation segment that explores punch card looms. All of our Innovation Nation clips can be found on the Henry Ford's YouTube channel. For great activities, hands-on activities, to build your habits of an innovator, I suggest you head over to the Henry Ford's Model I Primer page. You'll find our Primer Plus activities on our website, and they are free under the Education tab. And I want to say thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's really great to have you here. Thanks for being with us. Thanks to our donors. Without you, programs like this would not be possible. And we'll see you next week for another Innovation Journey Live.